You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 26th of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, as the end of the first phase of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire nears, there is hope that it will hold. Israel agrees to release Palestinian prisoners who are due to be freed last week. More from our Middle East correspondent in just a moment. Also ahead, Yoon Suk Yeol delivers a final defence of his imposing martial law. We'll be in Seoul to look back at this, the first of two historic trials of South Korea's president. Plus, after a quarter of a century, measles returns to the USA just at the moment when the country's health secretary is a vaccine skeptic. We'll hear from the man behind the Oscars.
I think the Oscars still have incredible cultural impact globally. Unlike some award shows in the US, our award show has a global footprint and is becoming more and more global.
More from Bill Kramer a little later, and we'll enjoy the latest music news too. Plus, the papers come from Du Forststrasse 90 in Zurich today. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. So a look at what else is happening in today's news. The US and Ukraine have agreed on the terms of a draft minerals deal, which is key to Kyiv's winning Washington's support. Israeli warplanes have hit a town south of Syria's capital. A Syrian security source said a military site was targeted. And the Trump administration is to take on the responsibility of deciding which reporters are to be allowed to be part of the White House press corps. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, talks for a second phase of a Gaza ceasefire deal remain on track. Israel has agreed to release Palestinian prisoners who were due to be freed last week. I'm joined now by Monocle's Middle East correspondent Leila Molana-Allen. A very good morning to you. Welcome back, Leila.
Hi there, man.
This was an agreement that was struck quite late last night, wasn't it? So just fill us in on the details, please.
It was with really sort of, the early hours of this morning. It was finally confirmed that this deal that's supposed to be completed on Saturday would be going ahead. Now, there's been so much back and forth over the last few weeks. This was the final stage of this first stage of this ceasefire deal. And what was supposed to happen this week is that four bodies of Israeli hostages, the final four hostages in this deal, were supposed to be released. But on Saturday, when the last six remaining living hostages were released, the 620 Palestinian prisoners that were supposed to be released in return did start to leave the prison and suddenly turned back at the last minute. And Israeli authorities came out and said that because of the humiliating ceremonies, as they called them, that the hostages had been put through, paraded by Hamas on stages before they'd been released on Saturday, they would not be releasing those prisoners, and there will be no more prisoners released until it was agreed that that wouldn't happen again. So one can only presume that this deal will mean that when these four bodies are released this week, they will not go through the same kind of ceremony in Gaza, being paraded through the streets of Gaza as the past four coffins did when they were released last week. It was really the Egyptians that put a huge amount of pressure for this deal to go through. But of course, that just completes stage one of the ceasefire this weekend. We still have no news on whether the deal see the second round of the ceasefire, which is for the remaining 60 hostages in Israel. And of course, the complete pullout of IDF troops from Gaza will go ahead. There have been no negotiations confirmed on that thus far.
Let's talk about the negotiations that we do know that have been successful, notably the ones that the Egyptians have pushed through. Do we have any indication as just to how hard it was to get this to get over this obstacle?
Incredibly difficult. It's been sort of on both sides, this kind of rising game, essentially, where each side has accused the other of more and more violations. A couple of weeks ago, Hamas started accusing Israel, rightly, of violating the ceasefire and that they weren't allowing in all the aid. They said they would, only about 2/3 of it's got in. The fuel, they haven't allowed in all the prefab tents and caravans, 60,000 of them that are supposed to come in to help Gazans live while the place is rebuilt. And on the other hand, of course, Israel has accused Hamas of not treating hostages well, of, as I say, parading these humiliating ceremonies. The UN came out too after the 4 bodies in coffins were paraded around, saying, this is a major violation of international law. And so both sides have been saying that they refuse to even begin negotiating the next round. So although Egypt was able to apply this pressure to complete just this little part, it's really, as I say, the next part that's sort of hanging in the balance. And there is going to be in Cairo a meeting of Arab League leaders next week. But that's more about trying to find a solution to Trump's plan for Gaza, which obviously has prompted so much outrage. Arab leaders want to try and find a way for Palestinians to keep living inside Gaza as they rebuild it. But that, of course, is going to cost billions of dollars and years to do.
It is astonishing, actually, the bumps in the road, if you can describe them as such, that have been overcome, though, between Hamas and Israel. Because, I mean, we have a 42-day phase of the deal, which we're currently in. It's set to expire on Saturday. And as you say, they need to be able to reach agreement to proceed to the second. Things look as if they are going in the right direction for that one. But if we just look back at what's happened in the last 6 weeks, we have hostages exchanges in the most garish nature. Then you have disputes over deal violations. Then you have Donald Trump wanting to remove Palestinians from Gaza and take control of the Strip. I mean, if you were looking at it from the most optimistic point of view, the fact that the ceasefire has survived this long cannot be sort of go unnoticed.
That's absolutely the case. I mean, look, this was such a hard-won ceasefire deal. Of course, nothing had happened in terms of a ceasefire since November 2023, and finally, after 15 months of war, managing to achieve, another ceasefire, and a really major one in this case that everyone hopes will continue, has been so hard won. And that's really been due to so much collaboration and pressure from figures in the region. Of course, Qatar has long been maligned for allowing Hamas political leaders to live there. But the reality is that that's the only way these negotiations have been able to happen, is through the Qataris. Cairo, the Egyptians have put so much work into trying to make this happen. And of course, as much as people malign Trump's ideas for Gaza, the thing he did contribute is that Biden, for so long, was unwilling to really put the pressure on Netanyahu to actually get this deal through, which was mooted last May, and it took until this January, nearly a year, for the deal to actually go through. It was Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, who turned around in early January and said to Netanyahu, look, you're not going to get anything else. Take this deal now. Of course, since then, President Trump has really turned around to Netanyahu and said, look, I will back you, whatever you want to do. And right now, there is a lot of concern that we could go back to full war in Gaza. I was speaking to people on the ground in Gaza yesterday who are terrified that the bombing will resume. Right now, the position that Netanyahu is in is that people in Israel, the majority of people, want the second round of the ceasefire to go ahead because they are desperate to get their hostages back. Only about half of those hostages, we think, are still living. But of course, they want to retrieve the bodies as well and be able to bury them and try and start the healing process. But meanwhile, his government, his right-wing coalition, which is the only way that he was able to form a government the last time when they were elected, already one of his most famous or infamous right-wing ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir, who was the national security minister, resigned the day the first round of the ceasefire was agreed, because he said it's such a threat to Israeli security to have a ceasefire in Gaza. And now the other of the most famous, Bezalel Smotrich, who is the finance minister, is saying that he will resign if there's another ceasefire, another round of the ceasefire agreed. And of course, that means, if his ministers start pulling out, his right-wing government could collapse. So he's essentially caught between what public opinion wants and what will actually keep him in power right now. So there is a very strong chance that we could see an increase in hostilities in Gaza again, because of course they've never actually stopped bombing. There was huge bombing of the north of Gaza over the last few days. And meanwhile, of course, the IDF have launched a full military campaign in the West Bank, sending tanks into camps in the West Bank for the first time in 20 years, displacing 40,000 people, saying they will leave those tanks there for a year and none of those people will be able to go home. So we're definitely not seeing a sort of peaceful, closing down the war attitude from the Netanyahu government. We're seeing quite the opposite, in fact.
And looking ahead to the next phase, this now suddenly becomes much more complicated, doesn't it? Because Hamas needs to be persuaded to lay down its arms and leave Gaza, which is what Netanyahu wants to have, because his long objective is to annihilate Hamas. But Hamas is never going to want to give up its weapons because it is committed to defeating Israel. So where does this go next?
Well, that's exactly the problem. Now, look, the one thing I would say is that there were sort of very hard lines drawn over things in the first stage of the ceasefire, and both sides eventually backtracked on certain hard lines that then allowed them to push it through. So it's not impossible. But the issue we face right now is that essentially what the second stage of the ceasefire is supposed to be is a situation that neither side accepts. So Israel says that they can only completely stop the war, as you say, if Hamas completely disarms and no longer runs Gaza. Hamas obviously is absolutely not going to disarm or leave Gaza. But they have suggested that they might be willing to hand over power politically to another group. Whether that is enough for Israel is another question. And on the other hand, Hamas has said that they will only agree to the next round of the ceasefire if the IDF troops completely withdraw from Gaza, which Netanyahu has said is absolutely not going to happen. They want to install another much larger buffer zone than before, but they have withdrawn from the XRM corridor now, the central sort of route through the Gaza Strip, which they previously said that they would not do. So there are possibilities here. Fundamentally, the issue is what happens next. Really this next stage leading into stage 3, if they do manage stage 2, which was about ending the war, stage 3 is about rebuilding Gaza. Now, the question is, who would run Gaza? Theoretically, the Palestinian Authority, which runs the West Bank, but there is absolutely no respect among Palestinians for the Palestinian Authority. Mahmoud Abbas, who leads the Palestinian Authority, really is seen as kind of completely out of touch, not having done anything. There's also huge anger because Palestinian Authority police are seen as complicit with the IDF and sort of having allowed them to invade all these camps in the West Bank and not really stop them, including arresting Palestinians themselves. So there's absolutely no appetite or authority for the Palestinian Authority to run Gaza. It seems like it just wouldn't work. But there isn't really another option either. So then the question is, are there new Palestinian leaders? Is there another coalition? There doesn't really seem to be any possibility there at all. And Mahmoud Abbas has said that he is completely unwilling to countenance any other option other than the PA running Gaza. So there are huge sticking points here. And we're really talking about sort of very long-term solutions. And it brings us all back to, for many people, what they would say caused this whole situation in the first place over many, many years. And when I say that, I of course mean Hamas running Gaza, not the October 7th attacks, which of course are the direct reason why this war started. But the fact that Palestinians want their territory to properly belong to them. Israel did pull out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, but has besieged it ever since. So it hasn't really been a free territory. And so this question of Palestinian statehood remains. And until that's resolved, really, these long-term questions will all be up in the air because all the different options that Gaza is looking at are other forms of occupation, be it US-led, be it Egyptian-led. None of those are options that Palestinians are happy with.
Leila Molana-Allen, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. 16:14 in Seoul, 7:14 a.m. here in London. Now, South Korea's President Yoon Suk Yeol defended his decision to impose martial law on his country last December, saying what he did was both lawful and necessary. He was giving his closing statement to the 8 justices who will decide his case at the Constitutional Court in Seoul. It's one of 2 cases involving the president, the other being a criminal trial against him on charges of insurrection. Well, I'm joined by Jaep S. Kwak, who's a Seoul-based journalist. Good afternoon, Jaep.
Good morning to you.
Thank you very much indeed for saying that. Jaep, it was an incredibly, I'm not quite sure how to describe the kind of defence that he mounted. It was impassioned, and it was absolutely, he was very self-assured, wasn't he?
Oh, absolutely. I think I would call it a spirited defense, to say the least. I think he has been emboldened since December by the slow but very significant rise of support for his arguments that North Korea is actively behind so-called anti-government forces, and therefore the martial law was declared as a necessary, what he called it, an emergency warning against anti-state forces. He also refused to enter the courtroom until his turn for the closing statement. So that was already, actually more than 7 hours into the last day of the trial.
Explain a little bit more about what his supporters are now doing. I mean, you mentioned the fact, and we have seen this swell of support from him with, I think, an estimated 190,000 people have now signed a petition against the impeachment. You have huge numbers of people sitting out, literally bringing chairs and sitting outside the Constitutional Court in protest to this. But the reasons behind it and the fact that it seems to be pushed by the far right doesn't make it just the most straightforward of protest movements, does it?
You're right, absolutely. And I think certain analysts have called this an interesting kind of overflow of YouTube conspiracy theories that are now, spilling over to the streets. Yoon has confessed to watching a lot of YouTube himself and a lot of these far-right conspiracy theories that are arguing that North Korea is actively controlling certain lawmakers, for example, or certain trade union officials to undermine his government, try to lay as many roadblocks as possible against his policies, or have as many protests as possible, in the middle of Seoul or in front of his residence. Since he came to office in May 2022. But I think the more interesting or the more insightful, overview of the current situation is that acute polarization will continue to remain in Korean politics, whichever way the ruling goes. And his approval rating is now close to 50%, although just as many people have responded saying that they support his impeachment. And this is because Korea does have history with military dictatorship. Therefore, any kind of moves like martial law that is akin to coup or akin to taking over a government against democratic rules is viewed very negatively across all generations. But to finish off, I suppose this Yoon's arguments, as well as the far right arguments, have been gaining a lot of support among those over 60. And these are the people who experienced higher inter-Korean tensions, as well as the military dictatorship. So this is such an interesting development of how South Korea, that has risen from abject poverty in the 60s and 70s to one of the wealthiest countries in the world, to kind of catch up in a way with this democratic system and how it's supposed to function.
Indeed. Did this or have these trials exposed existing fault lines, what you have just described, or have they opened up a new generation of problems which South Korea perhaps has never had to even think about before?
I think it's always been there, but it's been that they've been ignoring, the major parties have been ignoring these issues for a long time, because obviously the Cold War had ended for most part of the world, but we had North Korea. But these, I don't know what to call it. It's kind of these kind of ingrained beliefs or conspiracy theories about North Korea being a Svengali behind certain important government decisions has always been there, but it was dormant for a while, and then it resurfaced when a left-wing government would be in power, things like that. But because the South Korean elections tend to also be focused or tend to be divided along geographical lines, certain parts of the country is very pro one party, and then the other part is pro the other party. And so that dynamic, the geographical rivalry dynamic, had been overshadowing these kinds of fault lines for many decades.
Jayop Esquak, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Seoul. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue with today's newspapers. Joining us from our Zurich studio, Dufourstrasse 90, Noel Salmi, travel, culture and sustainability writer. Very good morning to you, Noel. How is D90 this morning? How is Zurich?
Zurich is great today.
Good. Glad to hear it. Except if you work in the Swiss Department of Defense.
Yes, except if you work in the Swiss Department of Defense. Apparently, it is in total disarray. It's in all the papers. I was listening to it on the Swiss radio this morning. So the head of the Department of Defense, Viola Amherd, shocked everyone when she announced her resignation on January 15th. Then what happened, unbeknownst to literally pretty much anyone, is that 5 days later, the head of Switzerland's intelligence services, Christian Ducy, had submitted his resignation to her. And a few days after that, the Army Chief Thomas Süssli tendered his resignation. However, no one else seemed to know. And members of the Swiss Federal Council found out when it was leaked to the media publication NZZ.
What's gone wrong here, Noel?
What's gone wrong? Well, one of the things that has possibly gone wrong is that there has been a lot of publications about some problems with federal contracting. There is a company called RUAG, which is a Swiss-owned arms manufacturer, and an audit report by the Swiss audit authorities showed that they had been basically massive fraud. One person for years was making money at this defense manufacturer by just crazy number movement, buying something for 4.5 million francs, and then he would say it was worth 1.5 million, but it was really worth 380,000 francs. I mean, it's all rather confusing, but that happened. There was serious organizational failures there, and that I think is one of the reasons that there was pressure. There really is there is, listening to the radio this morning, that we're talking to an Army expert, and he basically said that the problems that you're seeing here aren't only due to Viola Amherd, whose leadership actually had been praised until more recently, but it reflects sort of 30 years of neglect, really a focus on the defense forces in Switzerland since the end of the Cold War.
And this is an interesting time for Switzerland that many would argue from the outside has always been the constant presence of calm, organised, military that's there on standby but never wishes to get involved for political reasons. But to see that the Swiss defence world to be in such disarray at a point where there is, 3 years into the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it really changes the external view of Switzerland, doesn't it?
Yes, it really does. And it's exactly as you say, everyone is alarmed because of the changing geopolitical landscape. And some people are criticizing the fact that why did the director Amherd keep it quiet? Perhaps the speculation is that she didn't want to alarm employees. But the thinking is that really had she let people know sooner, they could begin the process of finding successors to these two directors of the intelligence service and of the army. Originally, they had been praised because they really hadn't been involved in government so long, seemed to be fresh faces. But with these uncovered corruption scandal, which apparently was reaching high double-digit million amounts in terms of the money lost. The Tagesanzeiger says these resignations seem like desertion, exactly at the time as they're most needed. As you say, these leaders are leaving. So we will see who can come next.
Let's move on to a story in The Guardian about the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the far-right German party, which came second in this week's federal elections. It has welcomed back two leaders who previously had been sidelined because of their support for Hitler.
Yes, that's right. So Maximilian Krah resigned from the AfD's Federal Executive Board last June after he told an Italian newspaper that not all members of Adolf Hitler's SS party had been, quote, automatically criminals. Likewise, Matthias Helfferich resigned his parliamentary seat after a chat leaked where he'd said he was the friendly face of the Nazis. And after the AfD's surprisingly high win of 20% of the German electorate, they were both brought back in. And they were both brought back in. And as the SPD member Carmen Vega said, they were consciously deciding to put these right-wing extremists back in the front row because Krah, for example, who is very popular with male voters, he won the most votes in his constituency in Saxony. So now the AfD, even though they had been pressured by other right-wing parties like Marine Le Pen's party in France and Italy's Lega, they now decided that they feel strong enough to bring these really controversial people back in.
How is that being received in Switzerland? What are the Swiss papers saying about it?
What are the Swiss papers saying about the AfD? The Swiss papers right now are so focused on the defense issue that they're not really worried about what's happening up north in Germany.
Noel Salmi, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is 7:27 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The US and Ukraine have agreed on the terms of a draft minerals deal, which is key to Kyiv's winning Washington support. The agreement could open up Ukraine's vast mineral wealth to the United States, with Donald Trump seeking hundreds of billions of dollars from Ukraine to repay Washington for its help. The US Defence Secretary has welcomed the UK's decision to increase defence spending from 2.2% of GDP to 2.5% by 2027. Pete Hegseth called the move a strong step from an enduring partner. Israeli warplanes have hit a town south of Syria's capital, as well as the southern province of Daraa. A Syrian security source said the military site was targeted. And the Trump administration is to take on the responsibility of deciding which reporters are to be allowed to be part of the White House press corps. For more than a century, it's been decided by a group of media organizations called the White House Correspondents Association. The group says it'll never stop advocating for full transparency on behalf of the American people. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now, yesterday, Russia welcomed what it described as the US's balanced position after Washington voted with Moscow at the United Nations General Assembly to avoid condemnation of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Well, the financier and anti-Russia activist Sybil Browder has been warning companies against rebuilding economic ties with the Kremlin. Speaking to Andrew Mueller at the Munich Security Conference, he began with his reaction to the US softening its stance.
We know that Vladimir Putin will be celebrating in the Kremlin to see that this kind of language, this kind of narrative, which comes straight out of, Kremlin propaganda, would be repeated by an American vice president. But there is some upside to this whole thing, and, sort of contrarian upside, I would say, which is that this is a rocket right up the backside of every European politician that it's time to band together and not be so ridiculously weak and meek.
But how many of those rockets have they had over the last decade or so, though?
Nothing like this. This is a momentous, historic rocket right up their backside.
I mean, do you get the sense, though, that there is going to be some part of European countries individually, perhaps Europe collectively, that will revert to thinking, because 80-year-old habits of thinking are hard to break, that we must keep in with the United States at all costs, even if one of those costs is Ukraine?
No, that's not going to happen. Ukraine is an existential issue for Europe. It's an issue that will end up potentially, if things go along the way that the trajectory that was started in the last couple of days, it will go towards severing a long-time alliance in the national interests of European countries.
Do you think there is any prospect, though, that European countries could find a way to persuade President Trump that actually staying the course where Ukraine's concerned is, if not in, because he's probably not all that likely to care about Europe's interest, perhaps not even the interests of the United States, but if they can persuade him it's in his personal interests?
Well, the one thing I would say about Trump is that he's going off on sort of random adventures that don't really amount to much. You know, he was talking about taking over the Panama Canal, and then Marco Rubio went down there and they agreed some meek agreement about, you know, a Chinese company that was operating out of Panama, and that was that. You know, that talked about Canada being the 51st state, and then they came to some agreement on creating a fentanyl czar. So, you know, Trump is all over the place. He says a lot of crazy stuff. He has a lot of strange ideas, and then none of it comes to much. And so, you know, we shouldn't, you know, decide that the world is coming to an end and the sky is falling. You know, it was pretty horrible what we've heard in the last couple of days, but doesn't necessarily amount to much if it doesn't amount to much. And so I think that, you know, words seem to be pretty cheap in this administration, and it's deeds that we need to be looking at. And it could be that the deeds are as bad as the words, or it could be like some of the other things we've seen that it doesn't end up being anything.
Well, on the subject of potential deeds, then, if Donald Trump woke up tomorrow morning, and you're quite right, it is never entirely predictable what he's going to decide is his cause or position of the day, and decided that more leverage could or should be applied to Russia, what is there that hasn't been tried? Is this where we get to those $300 billion in frozen bank reserves?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good example. So confiscate the frozen Russian central bank reserves. You know, for Trump, he's a business guy. He's talking about not wanting to spend his own money. Well, there's $300 billion sitting right there. Why not confiscate that stuff? And that would be a point of big pressure. Another point of pressure, which he's already mentioned, is oil. If the oil price was down $10 or $20, that might bankrupt Putin. Then, of course, there's lots of other sanctions that could be imposed. You know, Biden, who had the right sort of objectives, was a terrible implementer of those objectives. He was giving the Ukrainians, you know, too little, too late. He was applying sanctions too little, too late. There was a very meek U.S. policy to support Ukraine. And so, you know, if Trump wanted to, he could double down, triple down, and in a Trumpian fashion, really bring Putin to his knees if he wanted to.
Looking further ahead, obviously one potential solution to this, and I realise we are so far into the realm of the easier said than done here, but it is the idea of a different Russia. Have you developed, or have you met people who've developed any plausible thoughts of what that might look like? And this is bringing me to ask, obviously, about Vladimir Kara-Murza, who you played a role in getting him released. Is he the kind of person, does he even have ambitions in that direction, given the risks attendant to it, of being positioned as an alternative leader?
Well, I think he would very much want to be part of the democratic, you know, free regime of Russia if it were to happen. And I think there's no oxygen for any kind of opposition in Russia today, but there's also a much higher probability that it could all come undone in the same way as we saw in Syria. You know, the Russian economy, no matter what Putin says, is a mess. Russia's lost, you know, coming close to 1 million men, either dead or maimed. This is a very brittle regime that could come undone. And if it does come undone in a disorganized way, you know, the Russian people and the West will look for who the leaders are. And it would have been Alexei Navalny if he hadn't been murdered by Putin exactly a year ago, while we were here at this conference. You know, some of the more likely candidates would be people like Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, Garry Kasparov. There's a lot of people who can't be in Russia anymore because they would be either imprisoned or killed, but who exist, who are known to the Russian people and to the West as being, you know, Democrats and reasonable people.
Bill Browder there talking to Andrew Muller at the Munich Security Conference. You're listening to The Globalist. To 2:34 a.m. in Washington, D.C. Now, the last case of measles believed to be recorded in the USA was a quarter of a century ago. America had, or so it thought, eradicated one of the most contagious diseases on Earth. But 19 new cases have now been detected, chiefly among children in Texas. Serious enough. But to add to this, measles returns to the USA just at the moment when the country's health secretary is a vaccine sceptic. Well, Dr. Chris Smith is host of the Naked Scientist podcast and a virologist at Cambridge University. Welcome back, Chris. Good to have you with us. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
Just explain to us, do we know why measles is back?
Well, I was having a look at the cases and the reports that have been issued in Texas, because this is one part of Texas. And the numbers are quite high. There are well over 100 declared cases. And most of them are in people who are 5 to 18 years old, with a smaller number in the younger and older than that age groups. And most of them, as in more than 95% of the cases, are unvaccinated individuals. And if you look at the vaccination rates in most schools in that part of America, they're very, very high. They've got very good uptake of vaccines. So really, this is probably a group of people, edge cases, where they're unvaccinated, possibly vaccine avoiders, possibly the legacy of COVID, where people were put off of vaccination, various reasons. And what this has done is to create a threshold population of susceptible people, subverting herd immunity, and all it takes is a person to come in incubating measles, land in that sort of milieu, and it's so infectious. Measles is probably the most infectious virus that we know about. If you think about during COVID, we talked a lot about the R value, and this is a measure of, if I've got an infection, how many people do I pass it on to? That's the R value. Well, for COVID, it was about 3. For measles, it's 20. So each infected case infects about 20 other people. So if you have somebody who comes into a very propitious environment where there are lots of susceptible people, you'll very quickly spawn an outbreak, and that's almost certainly what's going on.
And measles, to many, is seen as a childhood disease which you just have a couple of days off school and you feel groggy and awful. But actually, it is a much more threatening virus, isn't it?
It's definitely not a mild childhood illness. And around the world, about 100,000 people a year die of measles. Now, most of them in poorer countries where the healthcare is much less robust. But at the same time, you do get severe cases in first world countries as well. America, UK, often cases being brought in from abroad. But we're seeing a state where we're not vaccinating enough people, we are getting these sorts of escapes and we are getting outbreaks. We had a brush with this in the UK in the last 6 months. We've had quite high numbers and we became quite worried about this. It is a severe disease. It does have significant consequences. It causes all kinds of problems ranging from bad eyes, bad nervous system inflammation problems and encephalitis, chest infections and diarrhea. So all kinds of things can happen in the short term, and then longer term there are some quite nasty complications as well. So measles is definitely one to avoid, and historically used to kill many, many more people, but thankfully it's only 100,000 now per year thanks to vaccination.
How much, therefore, is this a setback?
Well, it's a big setback, not just for America's rep, because once you have reached elimination status, there's a distinction between elimination and eradication. Eradication is what we've done to smallpox. It means the infection doesn't circulate anywhere. But when we talk about different geographies, we use the word elimination, meaning we don't have chains of transmission in that geography. And a number of countries which were previously very proudly measles eliminated have lost that elimination status. The UK among them. In the last 10, 15 years, we've gone from a measles eliminated country to one that no longer is because of a paucity of vaccine uptake. And there's a range of reasons why that tends to happen. But the thing is, it highlights the fact that we're very vulnerable as a population when you don't have high vaccination coverage, when you do have pockets of society that can brew outbreaks like this. It breaks down your ability to do herd immunity, which is how you protect everybody, including those who can't be vaccinated, by the vast majority of people not being able to catch the infection. And if you begin to erode that protection, you've then got the potential for chains of transmission across the community and beyond. And that's reputationally damaging, but it's also extremely health deleterious.
And explain now the political aspects to this, because we had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being confirmed as US Secretary of Health. He is a man for a very, very long time, has been an environmental lawyer. He's been a campaigner. He has, I think, what the Financial Times has rather discreetly described as outlandish conspiracy theories as well. He's a proponent of those. But what has happened is that with the arrival of Kennedy, and indeed post-COVID, we've had what many people thought was vaccine skepticism, which belonged to a marginalised part of society. They were, considered to be cranks. This is now actually becoming more mainstream, isn't it, Chris?
Well, lots of people didn't suddenly become vaccinated just overnight. This has been brewing for a long time, and we've got the same problem in the UK. And I think this is a reflection on the world in general. We've got the rise of social media, the rise of misinformation, and this has become much more acute in the time since the COVID pandemic. I think because people became quite fatigued by vaccination, and they also became more susceptible to information being peddled online, and a lot of incorrect. And as a result, you get poorer educated groups more susceptible to mismessaging, and you get more mismessaging. And this all brews up into a perfect storm of lower uptake of preventative health steps like vaccination. And once you've got to a threshold number of people in the community who are under-vaccinated, then you have an opportunity. It's like growing your wood pile to a nice big size, so it's then the tinderbox that can cause an outbreak to happen. It's got to reach a threshold size, and that's been brewing for a while. But yes, you're right, the present political milieu does not help.
Indeed. I mean, when you see what's happening in the United States, and when the United States goes in that direction, and then we also have, let's say in Germany, we have the Alternative für Deutschland, has a lot of vaccine skepticism as well. From the position of a scientist, when you see two countries such as the United States and Germany having louder and louder anti-vaccine voices, what do you suddenly start to do? Do you start to kind of reassess the graphs? Do you have to start to mitigate for the return of various diseases? So how does this affect your long-term strategies?
Well, all of the above, really, because there's a political element to this, there's an educational element to this, and of course there's a medical consequence element to this. So you've got to plan for all of those things. So the here and now is, if you've got the risk of an outbreak of something, you have to make sure that you've got all the right things in place to deal with that, because that's going to happen, which means making sure you've got potential to detect the disease, to rein it in, and then intervene as to why it's happening, get people vaccinated, make sure you can protect the vulnerable, etc. And then you've got to look at the wider picture, which is, well, why are people becoming highly susceptible to this sort of messaging? Why is this gaining traction in society? What do we do to try to, with a longer term viewpoint, stop that and bring people back on side? Carrot works much better than stick. If you try and beat people around the head with messaging and tell them you've got to do this, just look at what happened when we started going down the path and thankfully retreated, where we were saying doctors can't come to work if you haven't had a COVID vaccine. Nurses can't come to work if you haven't completed a COVID vaccine. Healthcare workers in care homes can't come to work, and some of them are even fired. This is in the UK for not having a COVID vaccine. Once you get to that position, it really puts people's backs up. You've got to take people with you, not try and herd them ahead of you. So there needs to be an education, and there needs to be a kind of a reinforcement of good public health practice and help for people so they understand how this works. And if you're equipped with the right information, you're less likely to fall into the trap of believing misinformation. It's almost like what they call cognitive vaccination or pre-bunking. You give people the tools to pick apart a strong argument that's coherent from one which is just made up.
Chris Smith from Cambridge University, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Time for a roundup of music news with Will Hodgkinson, the Times rock and pop critic. Good morning, Will. How are we?
Good morning. I'm okay, thank you. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Glad to hear that Kate Bush has released a new album, ladies and gentlemen.
Yes, well, she's not the only person who's released a new album. She's released it with Annie Lennox, Damon Albarn, about 1,000 musicians. And this is the Silent album in protest against government plans to allow AI creators to use content, essentially. The sort of get out clause is that you can say that you want to opt out, but of course that's impossible. You're not going to constantly be contacting AI companies to say that you don't want your music, which is online, to be used to program artificial intelligence. And so it's a very, very interesting point in history. I'm sure you saw the papers yesterday where every single newspaper had a wraparound cover saying "Make it fair." So it's a very, very big deal. And Paul McCartney's been talking about it a lot. It's, AI is here, but it's a question of how it's utilised.
I mean, when we mean AI is here and how it is utilised, could you actually sort of lay out just how much of an influence it is at the moment and where the real pinch points are?
Sure. I mean, if I imagine from my own point of view, I've written books. Artificial intelligence can take those books and use it to program itself. Now, that's essentially breaking copyright. If another author took a chunk of that book and just claimed it as their own, I'd be able to sue them. With AI, because it's so massively complicated, you can't do that. But it adds up to the same thing. So what will end up is albums that sound like Kate Bush because they've been programmed using Kate Bush albums. So you can see where the problem lies.
You can absolutely, but you can also see the idea that obviously money needs to be ploughed back into the music industry. Is there any sense that? Is there any beneficial influence that AI could have when it comes to music? Or is this just everything is a sort of a hacking away of creativity?
Well, I think AI is used already. If you think about in music, it's the equivalent of, a spell check is essentially artificial intelligence, on your computer. And music is used the same way. I mean, there are programs, auto-tune is kind of a form of AI and so on. So it's a question of what the person making the music is doing with it. If it's being used against their will to take what they've done and make something which sounds like them but isn't them, then of course that's should be highly illegal.
Let's move on to troubling K-pop.
K-pop, yeah. So this is a lot of people would have seen the White Lotus. One of the breakout stars of it is Lisa. She's got an album out on Friday. She was in the band Blackpink, and she's set to become a huge, huge star in the West. She's already absolutely huge in Asia. And this is coming at a crunch time for K-pop because there's a band called New Jeans who were created. K-pop bands are always created in these kind of fame academies. And they have accused their former label of workplace bullying, saying that they were treated abominably, they had no freedom whatsoever, that they were basically like in a workhouse, but for pop stars. This has been going on in K-pop for a long time, but it's the first time that a created band has actually, sort of sacked their label and gone into litigation against them. In fact, just today, they were found out that there's a law passed to say that they were not... The label, which is called Hybe, was not guilty of workplace bullying. But I don't think it's going to end there because it's a huge thing. It's almost what the entire K-pop industry is built on. And what all the K-pop sort of founders, what the companies are saying is that this is now going to be a point at which foreign investment is going to take over because it's going to be used as an excuse to, for Western labels just to take over the whole industry because it's so massive. So it's an interesting sort of... crisis point in a giant K-pop industry.
Indeed. Is there any element that would actually make K-pop any better?
You mean musically or ethically?
Deliberately open question, Will.
I mean, it depends on your predilection for entirely manufactured pop with very sort of high pitches and lots of hooks. So, and in terms of the morals, I mean, K-pop is pretty brutal. These kids are they audition from thousands upon thousands of kids at 14 or 15. So they're made to feel very, very lucky when they get through. And then they're put through these kind of boot camps, which 14-hour days. They're not allowed to have any, their romantic lives have to be put on hold. They essentially don't have their own lives anymore. And that's what New Jeans, this all-female K-pop group we're talking about. And unfortunately, the law has gone against them. But I don't think it's going to be the last of it.
Finally, let's talk about A.G. Cook. I didn't know who he was until I was warned that I was going to have to talk about him this morning, but he's incredibly influential.
Well, what's so interesting about A.G. Cook, first of all, he's the son of Alexander Cook of Archigram, the visionary architects who envisioned pop-up cities and balloons that would drop down culture on otherwise dull seaside towns. So he was, his father was this visionary architect, and he's a sort of visionary pop producer. He produced Charlie XCX's album Brat, which is, I'd be amazed if it doesn't clean up at the Brit Awards this Saturday. And he's already won Producer of the Year at the Brit Awards. And his whole approach, he created this thing called PC Music when he just came out of Goldsmiths. And it was really a sort of comment on cyberculture and, the sort of the idea that you could create pop stars out of normal people and then treat them like pop stars. And the whole thing just existed online. Initially they didn't even release any CDs or albums or anything. It's very, very interesting guy. I think he's a kind of intellectual who happens to be a pop producer, which is not normally the case. So, yes, it's just interesting that he is, he did an album in 2020 which had 49 tracks, a lot of them completely unlistenable. Really experimental, essentially. And he's now at the heart of mainstream pop culture, really because of the Charlie XCX album.
Very briefly, A.G. Cook, is he going to be one of the great British exports of music? Because a lot of people are complaining that British pop is on the decline, bar, dare I say, Charlie XCX and, regretfully, Central C.
Well, I think people. This has been a report recently about, and it's all based on economics. I think that in these situations, British pop is often in a very creative period. And what's happening now is that while you have these very polished pop stars in America, like Sabrina Carpenter, you're getting these new wave of pop stars like Charlie XCX and even younger a woman called Lola Young, who are sort of celebrating their flaws. And I think that's a very British thing. So personally, I think British pop's in a good place. Economically, it might not be as strong as it was, but I think we need to hold our nerve there.
Will Hodgkinson, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. It's the Oscars this weekend. They still command sizable interest around the world, and it's undoubtedly the most important of all the film awards. Well, Monocle Radio's senior correspondent, Fernanda Augusto-Pacheco, has spoken to the man behind the show, Bill Kramer, the CEO of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. And Fernando began by asking Bill to describe why the awards telecast is still so important.
I think the Oscars still have incredible cultural impact globally. Unlike some award shows in the US, our award show has a global footprint and is becoming more and more global, which I think for your listeners and readers is very interesting. People love the movies, and people may be enjoying movies differently these days. Some people are streaming at home, but the world is making and watching movies more than ever. And we are at the center of that. And the Oscars do this better than any other show or organization. Our Academy does this. We celebrate cinema and bring the world's attention to the work of our cinema artists and professionals across disciplines. So as you said, the lead up to the Oscars and the night of, and even afterwards, I mean, people are still commenting on past Oscars, who they wanted to win versus who won or who didn't get nominated. It really invites the world to have a conversation around cinema. And that's so exciting. And it's still very prevalent.
Yeah, it's so funny how the comments go, because it can be a performance, it can be a dress, it can be anything. It can be even the look of someone when somebody gets an award. It's a really kind of, and how does the digital presence of the Academy is growing? I think you guys are very much connected to the audience. I did notice that, especially in the last year.
Oh, absolutely. And since I've been CEO, it's been about 3 years now. We've made a concerted effort to grow our social presence, our digital presence. And you're really seeing that over the last 18 months. So going back to your comment about the Oscars and the impact of the Oscars, it's about the show. It's about the lead up to the show. It's about who's watching the show, but it's also about who's engaging with our social channels, which, millions and millions of people around the world. I mean, we said this earlier, we have so many Portuguese comments these days because of a current nominee and a current film that's getting a lot of great attention. So the world is communicating with each other through our social media channels, and that's really exciting, and that will only grow.
And I want to ask you about this year's ceremony. Of course, there'll be a lot of amazing stuff and perhaps a few surprises. We can talk about this later. But of course, Los Angeles had a very difficult time this year because of the fires. Was it a challenge, and how are you going to represent that at the ceremony? Or because, a lot of people that work in the industry have been affected as well.
We will definitely recognize the strength and resilience of Los Angeles. Los Angeles has been a home for movie making and creative visionaries for well over a century at this point. And we will have a moment to honor that on the show. It's going to be beautiful.
I want to ask as well, what's your relationship with ABC? Of course, they've been showing the Oscars for years. Is it in a healthy position? So I wanted to know a little bit more, because, of course, it's one of their big kind of events of the year as well.
We have a great relationship with Disney, and that means ABC, and then their international arm, Buena Vista International. The Oscars are shown in more than 200 markets around the world. We have 4 more years left on our contract with ABC, including this show. And we've had an incredible relationship with them that continues. So we're really lucky to have a great partner in Disney and ABC, and now Hulu, which is part of their family. We're streaming live on Hulu in the US and on Disney Plus in some other markets around the world. So our relationship with Disney evolves and is stronger than ever.
Well, that's fantastic. And tell us, what are the surprises for this year's Oscars? I know you probably can't say much, but the Oscars are approaching its centenary as well. That's impressive. So
that's right.
4 more years or 3 more years for this?
Our 100th show will take place in 2028. Can you believe it?
Wow.
It's really exciting. So that's 27 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences. 28 is our 100th Oscars. So we have a couple of big years in front of us and surprises on the show. I'm not going to give away anything that hasn't already been announced, but as you saw earlier today, we announced a slate of performers: Cynthia Erivo, Ariana Grande, Doja Cat, Lisa Ray, Queen Latifah. We have some amazing performances lined up. Again, Conan hosting is going to be brilliantly funny and will really bring the world together around cinema. We have great presenters lined up. We've had many announcements about that over the last couple of weeks. So you're going to see some incredible film stars on that stage. And it's going to be a beautiful evening of celebrating the collaborative nature of movie making. That's who we are, and that's what we do. And only the Oscars can deliver this.
Bill Kramer there, CEO of the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, talking to Fernanda Augusta Pacheco. You can listen to the full interview with Bill on the Monocle Weekly on monocle.com. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests. Thanks too to the producers, Anita Riotta, Tom Webb and Chris Chermak. Our researcher was Maisie Ringer. Our studio manager was Flynn Simons, with editing assistance from Elliot Greenfield. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.